Childbirth has been happening for approximately 300,000 years longer than hospitals have existed. This is worth sitting with. The human species became the human species, spread across every continent, built the first civilizations, invented writing, mathematics, philosophy, and the wheel. All before anyone developed the concept of a dedicated medical facility where births could be managed under clinical conditions. Every person who ever lived before the 19th century was born without a hospital. Every person who ever lived before the 20th century was born without the specific combination of antiseptic technique, trained obstetric care, and emergency surgical capability that characterizes modern hospital birth. And the species survived. More than survived, it grew, expanded, and thrived to the point of producing 8 billion people, which suggests that the pre-hospital birth system was working well enough to sustain population growth across the entire span of human prehistory and history until very recently. The question is, how? And the answer involves female knowledge networks. Specific birth positions that have biomechanical advantages over the modern hospital default, herbal pharmacology that was considerably more sophisticated than most people realize, a role that existed in virtually every human culture called the midwife, and some very interesting comparisons between ancient birth outcomes and modern ones that complicate the simple narrative of medical progress. Let's go through it properly. Start with the biology, because understanding why human childbirth is as challenging as it is provides essential context for everything that follows. Human birth is, by the standards of the mammalian world, extraordinarily difficult. Most mammals give birth with relatively little difficulty. The newborn passes through the birth canal head first. The canal is wide enough relative to the infant's head to allow fairly smooth passage, and the process is typically rapid. Complications exist but are relatively uncommon. Human birth is complicated by two evolutionary developments that are individually spectacular adaptations, but that are in direct conflict with each other. The first is bipedalism. Walking upright on two legs required a restructured pelvis, narrower, more bowl-shaped, with a birth canal that is significantly smaller relative to the size of the animal than in quadrupedal mammals. The second is encephalization. The human brain is enormous relative to body size, and the skull that contains it is correspondingly large. A large-brained infant must pass through a narrow pelvis, and the result is a birth process that is mechanically challenging in ways that have no parallel in our closest primate relatives. Human newborns are also born at an earlier developmental stage relative to other primates. The brain that is already large at birth would be significantly larger if gestation continued long enough for the same degree of development seen in newborn chimpanzees, making birth literally impossible. The newborn human is therefore born in a state of profound helplessness that requires sustained care for years, compared to the relatively rapid developmental independence of most other mammalian young. The consequence of this evolutionary compromise is that human birth is an event that can go wrong in ways that the birth of most other mammals simply cannot, and that has therefore always required skilled assistance. A chimpanzee giving birth alone in a tree is doing something that works reliably in the vast majority of cases. A human giving birth alone, without assistance, faces a significantly higher rate of complications that would, without intervention, be fatal to the infant, the mother, or both. This is why every human culture that has ever been documented has developed an institution around childbirth, a social structure that brings experienced people together around the birthing woman to provide assistance, support, and management of complications. The specific form of this institution varies enormously across cultures and time periods. The underlying need it addresses is universal and is rooted in the specific biomechanical reality of human birth. That institution is, in its most basic form, the midwifery tradition. And it is older than civilization, older than agriculture, older than anything else we might comfortably call a human institution. The word midwife comes from Old English meaning with woman, a direct description of the role. The midwife is the person who is with the woman during birth, not necessarily doing complicated procedures, not necessarily wielding medical technology, present, experienced, knowledgeable, and capable of providing the assistance that the specific mechanical and physiological challenges of human birth require. Archaeological evidence for midwifery is indirect but compelling. Figurines associated with childbirth, female figures in birth positions, figures that appear to represent an assistant behind or supporting a birthing woman, appear in archaeological contexts across multiple cultures. In ancient Egypt, the birthing stool, a specially designed seat that allowed a woman to give birth in a semi-upright position with space below for the infant to emerge, is depicted in temple art and described in medical papyri. The existence of specialized birth equipment implies the existence of specialists who knew how to use it. Written records of midwifery appear among the earliest written documents in multiple cultures. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical text from approximately 1550 BCE, describes procedures for managing difficult births, for determining whether a woman is pregnant, and for predicting the sex of an unborn child. The Hippocratic Corpus in ancient Greece discusses normal and complicated birth in considerable detail. The Talmud discusses midwifery. Roman medical texts by Cyrannus of Ephesus, writing in the 2nd century CE, produced a comprehensive obstetric textbook that remained in use for centuries. These are texts from relatively advanced civilizations. They were codifying and systematizing knowledge that had existed in oral and practical form for much longer. The accumulated wisdom of generations of birth attendants transmitted from experienced midwives to their students through direct apprenticeship. Now let's talk about birth positions, because this is where the contrast between ancient practice and modern hospital practice is most stark and most interesting from a biomechanical perspective. The modern hospital default birth position is the lithotomy position, the woman lying on her back with legs elevated and spread. This position became standard in hospital obstetrics during the 17th and 18th centuries, partly because it provided the attending physician with better visual access to the birth canal, and partly because it placed the physician in a dominant position relative to the patient. It is, from a biomechanical perspective, one of the less advantageous positions for giving birth. When a woman lies on her back during birth, she is working against gravity. The infant must be pushed horizontally or slightly upward rather than downward. The sacrum, the lower portion of the spine that forms the back wall of the birth canal, is compressed against the surface the woman is lying on, which reduces the available diameter of the birth canal by a measurable amount. The pressure required for effective pushing is reduced because the diaphragm cannot work optimally in the supine position. The positions that most ancient cultures used for birth were upright or semi-upright, squatting, kneeling, sitting on a birthing stool, standing supported by an attendant. Gravity works with the process rather than against it. The sacrum is free to flex backward, opening the pelvic outlet. The pressure of pushing is more effective. The duration of labor is shorter. Contemporary obstetric research has confirmed what ancient tradition built empirically. Upright birth positions are associated with shorter second-stage labor, reduced rates of episiotomy, reduced rates of assisted delivery, reduced rates of abnormal fetal heart rate patterns, and higher reported maternal satisfaction. The positions that ancient women used without theorizing about their biomechanics are positions that biomechanical analysis confirms as superior to the hospital default. The squatting position specifically deserves attention because it appears in birth-associated imagery across cultures from ancient Egypt to pre-Columbian Americas to South Asian traditions, and because its biomechanical advantages are particularly clear. Full squatting increases the diameter of the pelvic outlet by up to 30% compared to the lithotomy position, a substantial difference that translates directly into easier passage of the infant's head. Now let's talk about pain management, because this is the dimension of ancient birth experience that modern accounts most often reduce to a simple observation that ancient women simply endured pain that modern women are spared. And this reduction significantly underestimates what traditional birth practice actually provided. Pain during labor is not a fixed, immutable experience. It varies substantially with the birthing woman's psychological state, her level of fear and anxiety, the quality of social support she receives, her physical position, her freedom to move, and the specific sensory environment she is in. The neurophysiology of pain perception, the gate control theory of pain, the role of endorphin release in sustained physical effort, the relationship between anxiety and pain amplification, means that the experience of labor pain is substantially modified by the conditions under which labor occurs. Traditional birth practice, in most cultures, created conditions that were significantly better for pain management than is commonly acknowledged. The presence of known, trusted people, the reduction of fear through familiar company, the freedom to move and change position, the ability to walk, sway, squat, lean. which both uses natural pain management movement strategies and facilitates fetal descent through positional changes. The use of water, immersion in warm water, application of warm compresses, which is one of the most effective non-pharmacological pain management strategies in labor, and is documented in traditional birth practice across cultures. Rhythmic vocalization, which is used instinctively by laboring women across cultures, and which activates the same neurological pathways as other pain management rhythmic activities. Traditional herbal preparations added a pharmacological dimension to this non-pharmacological foundation. Willow bark, the original source of salicylates, the compound class that includes modern aspirin, was used in pain management contexts across multiple traditional medical systems. Certain preparations with sedative properties were used to manage anxiety and promote rest during early labor. The pharmacological toolkit available to traditional midwives for pain management was limited compared to modern epidural analgesia, but it was not nothing, and it was deployed within a social and physical environment that was itself analgesic in ways that modern hospital birth often is not. Now let's talk about the herbal pharmacology of ancient birth practice in more depth, because this is the dimension most thoroughly dismissed by modern accounts and most thoroughly underestimated. Ancient midwives and traditional birth attendants across cultures worked with herbal preparations that had real physiological effects on the birth process. The knowledge of which plants to use, in what preparations, at what doses, and at what stages of labor was accumulated empirically across generations of practice in a process that was, in effect, applied pharmacology without the formal framework. Ergot, a fungal growth on rye and other grains, contains compounds that stimulate uterine contractions. Ergot preparations were used by midwives in Europe for centuries to manage labor that was not progressing adequately. The same active compounds were isolated in the 19th century and became the basis for pharmaceutical oxytocin analogs that are used in modern obstetrics to induce or augment labor. The traditional midwife using ergot preparations was using a cruder and less controllable version of the same pharmacological intervention. Blue cohosh and black cohosh, plants used by Native American traditional birth attendants, contain compounds with known uterotonic and hormone-modulating effects. Raspberry leaf, widely used in birth preparation traditions across cultures, contains fragrine, which has effects on uterine smooth muscle. Shepherd's purse was used historically to manage postpartum hemorrhage through its vasoconstrictive properties. These are not inert substances being used because of superstition or placebo effects. They are pharmacologically active plants whose traditional uses in childbirth correspond to their known biochemical properties. The traditional midwife who used these plants did not know their biochemistry. She knew their effects, learned from observation and transmission of knowledge across generations, and that empirical knowledge tracked the underlying pharmacology accurately enough to be useful. The management of postpartum hemorrhage deserves specific mention because hemorrhage is the leading cause of maternal mortality across history and remains the leading cause of maternal mortality in low-resource settings today. Managing excessive postpartum bleeding without surgical intervention required knowing which preparations promoted uterine contraction, because a well-contracted uterus after birth controls its own bleeding, and which substances provided external hemostatic support. Traditional midwifery across cultures had developed specific protocols for hemorrhage management that combined uterotonic herbs, specific manual techniques for uterine massage, and positioning of the mother to optimize blood flow. These were not perfect interventions. They were effective often enough that maternal survival after birth was the norm rather than the exception. Now let's talk about the social architecture of ancient birth, because the physical and pharmacological aspects of traditional birth care happened within a social context that was itself a form of support. Ancient birth was almost never a solitary experience. In most documented traditional cultures, birth was a women's social event, attended by female relatives, experienced birth attendants, and community members who provided practical, emotional, and ritual support. The birthing space was a female space, from which men were often explicitly excluded, that concentrated experienced reproductive knowledge in the location where it was needed. This social structure served multiple functions simultaneously. The practical function was the provision of multiple people available to assist with different aspects of the birth, to support the birthing woman physically, to prepare and administer herbal preparations, to assist with the delivery of the infant, to manage the placenta and cord, to care for the newborn. The emotional function was the presence of known, trusted people who provided reassurance and encouragement during a physically demanding and potentially frightening process. And the knowledge transmission function was the inclusion of less experienced women in birth events, where they could observe and learn from experienced practitioners. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. This last function is worth emphasizing because it addresses a fundamental challenge in maintaining knowledge across generations. Medical knowledge that is not written down can be lost within 1 or 2 generations if the transmission chain is broken. The inclusion of younger women in birth events as observers and assistants, beginning the apprenticeship process with the birth events themselves rather than with formal teaching, was a robust transmission mechanism that maintained midwifery knowledge across long periods without requiring literacy or formal educational institutions. The ritual dimension of ancient birth is equally important. Birth in most traditional cultures was embedded in ritual frameworks that assigned cosmic significance to the process, provided narrative structure for the experience, and connected the birthing woman to accumulated cultural wisdom about birth through ceremony, prayer, and symbolic action. The functional effect of this ritual embedding, reducing fear, increasing confidence, providing a framework within which even difficult experiences could be understood and endured, is real, regardless of the specific metaphysical claims of any particular tradition. Terror management during labor has the same neurophysiological effects whether it comes from epidural analgesia or from a deeply held sense that the community and the cosmos are present and supportive. Now let's talk about something that is rarely examined in discussions of ancient birth practice, but that the comparative anthropological record makes clear: the significant variation in birth outcomes across different traditional cultures and what that variation reveals about which elements of traditional practice were most effective. Traditional birth practices varied enormously in their specific protocols, their herbal pharmacopoeias, their social structures, and their ritual frameworks. Not all traditional birth practices were equally effective. Some cultural practices around birth, specific dietary restrictions during pregnancy, specific postures or positions used during labor that were less biomechanically optimal than others, specific interventions that were harmful rather than helpful, contributed to worse outcomes rather than better ones. The retrospective idealization of pre-modern birth practice is as distorting in one direction as the dismissal of all traditional birth knowledge is distorting in the other. What the comparative anthropological record shows is that the cultures with the best birth outcomes, measured by maternal survival and infant survival, were those that combined the highest density of experienced birth attendants with the widest practical knowledge base, the most flexible and responsive approach to individual labors, and the most effective social support structures. The skill and experience of the individual midwife mattered enormously. A single experienced midwife could make the difference between life and death in specific complications, and the cultures that invested most heavily in the development and support of skilled midwives had measurably better birth outcomes than those that did not. Now let's talk about infant mortality and maternal mortality in historical context, because any honest account of ancient birth practice has to acknowledge where it fell short and where modern medicine provides genuine and enormous improvement. Ancient birth was more dangerous than modern hospital birth by measures that are not ambiguous. Maternal mortality rates in pre-modern populations, estimated from skeletal evidence, from historical records, and from contemporary studies of populations without access to modern obstetric care, range from approximately 1 to 2% of births resulting in maternal death. This sounds low until you calculate it across a reproductive career. A woman who experiences 5 or 6 pregnancies has a cumulative maternal mortality risk of 5 to 10%. A real and significant risk of dying in the context of reproduction. Modern hospital birth in high-resource settings has reduced maternal mortality to approximately 0.01 to 0.02%. A reduction by approximately 2 orders of magnitude. This is one of the most dramatic improvements in human health outcomes produced by modern medicine, and is not in any way diminished by an appreciation of what traditional birth practice accomplished. Infant mortality in the perinatal period, Deaths occurring at or shortly after birth was also substantially higher in pre-modern contexts than in modern hospital settings. Many of these deaths resulted from complications that modern obstetric intervention can manage: prolonged obstructed labor, fetal malpresentation, umbilical cord complications, that traditional midwifery had limited ability to address. What traditional midwifery accomplished was not perfection. It was the reduction of birth mortality to the lowest level achievable without surgical intervention and without the specific knowledge contributions of germ theory, pharmacology, and the understanding of fetal physiology. Given those constraints, the achievement was remarkable. Populations sustained and grew, and the majority of births in most populations ended with both mother and infant alive and healthy. Now let's close with what this history reveals about knowledge, transmission, and the nature of medical progress. The traditional midwife working in a pre-literate, pre-scientific culture was not practicing primitive medicine. She was practicing empirical medicine. Knowledge derived from observation of outcomes across a large number of cases, refined across generations by the retention of effective practices and the gradual abandonment of ineffective ones. The pharmacology was real. The techniques were biomechanically sound. The social architecture of support was effective, and the accumulated knowledge that guided her practice was transmitted through apprenticeship systems that were remarkably robust across long periods. Modern obstetrics did not replace ignorance with knowledge. It replaced one knowledge system with a better one, a system that added surgical capability, antiseptic technique, germ theory, understanding of fetal physiology, and pharmaceutical precision to the empirical foundation that traditional midwifery had built. Some of what modern obstetrics added has turned out to be counterproductive, the lithotomy position being the clearest example of a practice adopted for physician convenience that biomechanics and outcomes research have shown to be inferior to traditional alternatives. The growing movement in contemporary obstetrics toward upright birth, continuous labor support, and non-pharmacological pain management is in many respects a return to practices that traditional birth attendants used for thousands of years. The woman who gave birth 10,000 years ago, squatting over a prepared surface, supported by experienced women who knew what to do and what to give her, was not in a primitive situation. She was in a system built by accumulated human intelligence applied to one of the most important biological events in any species' life. It worked, not perfectly, but well enough. And modern obstetrics at its best is the continuation and improvement of the same fundamental project, bringing human knowledge and human care to bear on the moment when a new person enters the world. That project is 300,000 years old. The hospital is a very recent addition to it.